First, I'm going to show you how to feed the mama. First, we're going to measure 200 grams of cold tap water. Straight from the tap, nothing special. Do not need to use bottled water for this. I would highly recommend using a scale and not doing this based on cups or tablespoons if you can. But you can find the conversions if that's all you have. We're going to add 40 grams of the mama. You can see how it floats, which means that it's very active and ready to be baked, or ready to bake with, and it's also good to feed. Now we got to add the food for the mama, which is the flour. We use a 50-50 mix of whole wheat flour and bread flour, so we keep it at 100% hydration. So we're going to add 100 grams of bread flour, 100 grams of whole wheat flour. I'm going to put on a glove for easy cleanup here, and we're just going to mix this. We're not looking to build gluten or develop gluten. We're just making sure that the flour gets hydrated and that mama kind of gets dispersed throughout everything so that it has access to all that food to eat. At the end, this is what it should look like. I like to keep my starter or mama at room temperature until the summertime hits and it's too warm, and then we keep it in a wine fridge, set to about 65 degrees. We find that this is the best case scenario for our starter. Realistically, if you're not going to bake with the starter every single day, it's probably best to keep it in the fridge. I would pull it out, once a week and feed it, a good feeding before putting it back in the fridge. And there's a bunch of information about this online. Just Google how to feed sourdough mama, and they'll give you, specific examples and show you everything you need to know. Once our starter is fed and it's had a chance to eat and get ready to make bread, we're going to go ahead and make what we call the Westport River sourdough. I call it that because I started the sourdough starter from unwashed grapes from Westport River's vineyard. And this was about 2014, so this starter is about 6 years old. I'm going to start by measuring 700 grams of warm water from the tap. We're looking for like 75 to 80 degree, so basically a little cooler than bath water. I like to use a heavy glass bowl so you can see the fermentation and sort of how it's working and happening. If you have a metal bowl, that's okay too. Any bowl is okay. Heavy duty would be best. Next, we're going to add 200 grams of the fed mama. So this mama was fed about 8 to 12 hours ago. You can see how it's floating, it's very active, and it's ready to make us a gorgeous loaf of bread. You can see how it's actually floating on the surface of the water, so it means that it's active. If it sank, it's probably not the best stage of your mama to make bread with. I want to make sure that the cultures in the mama get distributed throughout the whole loaf. So I'm going to go ahead and break that up and make sure that it's all throughout the water. Then we're going to add 900 grams of bread flour. We like to use King Arthur Sir Galahad, which is an artisan bread flour. You can also use any bread flour that you can find, or all-purpose would work okay here too. You may have to play with the hydration a little bit and cut back some water here or there. For a little bit of flavor and texture, we use 100 grams of whole wheat flour. Again, if you just wanted to use white flour, you could just do 1,000 grams total, or 1 kilo of bread flour. Now we're going to mix everything together to hydrate the flour. This is where your hands get dirty, but it's one of the best parts about baking bread. You can see how I'm squeezing sort of the dough, making sure that I get every flour pocket to be hydrated, because that's really important. We want to make sure that that culture is throughout the entire bread. Once everything is hydrated, I'm going to clean my hand off. And I'm gently going to go around the bowl and just clean up the sides of the bowl so we have one cohesive mass of dough. We're going to let this sit for 45 minutes, and this is technically called the autolyse. I've covered the bowl with saran wrap or plastic wrap. I'm going to write the time down so that I don't lose track of where I'm at in the dough process. Autolyse literally means self-breaking. So we basically allow the flour to absorb the water and become fully hydrated. The enzymes in the flour actually start to break down the complex starches into simple sugars so that the yeast can sort of eat those and turn them into carbon dioxide and the byproduct of alcohol. The gluten starts to form. We don't add our salt until after the autolyse because we want to give the flour the chance to hydrate first. Okay, in the meantime, we're going to measure our 22 grams of salt. We're using a fine sea salt here. At the end of that 45 minutes, we're going to go ahead and add the salt to the dough. So I'm going to unwrap the bowl. I'm going to sprinkle that 22 grams of salt over the dough as even as possible. And then in order to help sort of make this salt dissolve a little bit easier, I'm going to sprinkle a few drops of water to help incorporate into the dough. If you have a spray bottle, you could also spray water on top of the dough. That helps. Also, you'll notice every time I work the dough, I wet my hands. Dough doesn't stick to wet hands, so that's a little trick for you there. And now I'm just kind of, this is probably the most work you'll ever do for this loaf. I'm just mixing the salt in. And then I'm going to take the edges and fold them up, kind of stretch and fold until we get somewhat of a cohesive ball or bowl shaped. I'm going to cover the dough and write the time so I don't forget. And you can see how big it looks right now in the glass bowl for reference. The Tartine method really doesn't use kneading as much as it does folding. So in this video, you'll see that we fold the dough over itself a bunch of times. In order to build gluten, we want to expel that carbon dioxide so the sourdough culture can thrive. And we want to equalize the dough temperature, the middle and the outsides. As we fold it, they become equal temperatures. The number of folds is relevant. You can do 3 or 4, but I would encourage you to experiment and see what works best. So after 45 minutes, I'm going to wet my hands again, and we're going to go through and stretch, pull, and fold. Stretch, pull, fold. You see I do this to each side of the dough. If you can imagine, there's 4 sides. And you can feel sort of how the structure starts to build just by that first fold that we did. This is considered fold 1. We're going to do 3 of them. Again, I'm going to write the time, and we're going to leave it for 30 to 60 minutes at room temperature. You can see the dough start to rise and build volume. Here at the bottom, you can see those fermentation bubbles. That's why I like using a glass bowl. It's exciting to watch. I know it's a slow process. And now it's time for the second fold. So again, same thing, cover off, wet my hands, and we're going to stretch and pull and fold. It's really cool to feel how much the dough develops, by doing nothing, basically. We folded it the first time and it was okay. Now we're folding it a second time, and you can feel that gluten, that network, build up strength in the dough. We're going to cover and we're going to write the time again. This is our second fold that we just did. I like to use one piece of plastic wrap to not be wasteful, so I'm just crossing out the older time and writing the new one. It also helps me keep tracks of my folds. So this is the third fold. The dough should feel considerably stronger, more aerated, have more volume to it. Again, remember to wet your hands, stretch. Yeah, that's some good elasticity there with the dough. We're going to pull and fold. So on this one I decided to do 3 folds, so that was our third and final fold, and now we're going to go into the pre-shape portion of bread making. The pre-shape really sets the stage for the final shape. It gives us one more chance to develop a little bit of structure, and if you're not good at portioning your dough into 2 pieces, because this recipe makes 2 loaves, it helps you take all the small pieces that you might cut off accidentally to form one single loaf. It also helps us get a smooth final skin so we can make beautiful cuts. Before we pre-shape, we need to divide or portion our loaves. So again, this recipe makes 2 loaves. So I have a little bit of flour on my counter, and I'm going to take it out of the bowl. Being careful, not to squish the bread or ruin all those beautiful air cells and that structure that we just worked so hard to develop. You can certainly eyeball this if you'd like, but being a professional baker in the baking world, we want to make sure everything is exact and even. So we're going to measure, and we look anywhere between 925 to 950 grams of dough for each loaf. Notice how I'm keeping the floured side down at all times, and I'm not really switching it back and forth. That's because I really want to resist adding more flour. Flour is sometimes your enemy. Now that we have 2 equal portions, I'm going to pre-shape, which means I'm going to basically make the shape that I plan to make at the end, or facilitate the shape that I want to make at the end. We're making round loaves or boules today, so I'm going to make it into a pre-boule or a round loaf, if you can get that. You'll notice that I don't have a lot of flour on the counter because I don't want a lot of flour. I'm actually flipping my dough over so the sticky side of the dough is on the bench, and I'm using that tackness, that sticky side, to kind of build up surface tension and get a nice smooth top to my pre-shape. Here's a closer look at the pre-shape. You can tell it's not super perfect They're, for the most part round. There are some air bubbles there, but we have another opportunity to shape these. So I'm not super worried about that. In general, they're about the shape that I'm going to look for in my final shaping. I'm going to use the same piece of plastic wrap that I was using. I'm going to spray it with a little bit of pan spray, and then I'm going to put it over the dough and leave the dough right on the counter. And we call this the bench rest, or the bench proof. We're going to give it roughly 45 minutes, depending on room temperature in your house, to basically relax. It's going to flatten out kind of like a pancake, and then we're going to come back and final shape. While my dough is bench resting, I'm going to go ahead and prepare my banneton. Banneton is kind of like a wicker basket that's used professionally to give the bread a really nice look on the outside. You can see all those spirals of flour that will show up on our finished loaves. But it also helps really wet doughs kind of retain their shape and not get misshapen. If you don't have these, which I presume you don't, you can also use a bowl with a dish towel heavily floured, and that should be all right. Even like a cloth napkin might be a little bit better than the dish towel. Shaping is one of the things that takes the most practice, so don't expect to be perfect your first or second or third time. Basically, we just spent all this time and energy building up these air cells that are held by our gluten network, and we don't want to ruin them. So we want to make sure that our shaping is gentle but meaningful motion. We want to use the bench to sort of drag and stretch that outer dough layer, and that's what builds up the surface tension. You can see how our pre-shape has sort of flattened out, and it's no longer as high as it was. It's kind of flat like a pancake now. Um, Pay attention to what I'm doing here, because we want just a small light dusting of flour, and I want what was the top to become the bottom right now. So the floured top is now on the bottom, and I'm going to go ahead and shape this by bringing the top down about 3/4 of the way. I'm going to tuck in the shoulders, and then I'm going to bring the bottom up. Now I'm going to use my hands to drag and tighten up the skin, and you can see me, gently handling the dough, but making sure each of those movements, makes a difference. I'm basically looking for that really tight surface tension, and I'm using the tackiness of the dough and the table, how it interacts with it, to build up that surface tension. I'm going to show you a different angle of the same exact shaping way. I'm going to take some of this flour off the counter. I'm going to lightly dust on top and then turn so that the floured side is down. I'm going to bring the top down, stretch the shoulders and bring them inside the loaf, and then bring the bottom up and flip it. So now the bottom is on the top, and you can see my hands are on the table. I'm not lifting my hands so the dough sneaks out. I'm making sure that the dough drags against the table to tighten up that surface tension. You can see how we have a nice smooth and good surface tension skin. We like that, and that's a good bowl. If you mess up this stage, you want to let your dough rest for 30 minutes and then try to reshape. We're also going to let them sit for 5 minutes to seal on the bottom. I'm going to gently pick up my shaped loaves and put them into the bannetons. If you were putting them inside a towel, a heavily dusted towel, you might want to dust some extra flour on top of the loaves before turning them, seam side up into the bowl. I'm going to plastic wrap my bannetons really well, because these are going to go in the fridge for an overnight retard or proof. We call it retardation because we slow down the yeast in the fridge, but we don't stop the yeast, we just slow it down. So that's called retardation of the dough. So I'm going to make sure it's wrapped really well so it doesn't dry out in the fridge. Here are our two loaves. We're actually going to leave them at room temperature so that they can proof a little bit before we go ahead and slow that down. This was about 2 hours after proofing at room temp, and then I threw them in the fridge for the overnight. Shout out to Flying Carrot Farm, by the way. The next morning, the dough proofed to the top of the banneton, and it is ready to bake. So we're going to go ahead and preheat our oven to 500 degrees with our cast iron or Dutch oven inside the oven. And we want to give it some time to heat up, 1 hour minimum. And then we're ready to bake, and I'll show you that process. It's been out for about an hour to come up to room temperature. I unwrap the plastic wrap, being very gentle because remember, this is full of air cells that we don't want to ruin. I'm just going to go, slightly around and loosen up the edges. I'm sprinkling my parchment paper with a little bit of cornmeal, and then I'm going to turn my dough out onto the parchment paper. This is the benefit of having a banneton. You can see all those beautiful ring indents of the flour that make the bread just look, so beautiful. I'm now going to go ahead and cut my parchment paper. I'm going to leave, 2 handles on either side so that I can actually lower it into the Dutch oven. Now, there are people who, just dump the dough into the hot Dutch oven and then score it inside the Dutch oven. I don't like that method. I think it's pretty dangerous, but it is effective, although I would question if you lose, some of your air cells by dumping it into a pot. The reason we score bread or slash it before it goes into the oven is a way to facilitate the steam and the gas exiting. Basically, we want to choose where that steam and gas exit. So by making attractive slits or scores in the bread, we can facilitate that a little bit easier. Scoring is difficult, so practice, practice, practice. Here I'll show you a very simple pattern using a really sharp razor blade. It's kind of like a box or a square or a little bit of a hashtag. And that's a really nice score to do. Very simple, easy, clean. I'd recommend starting with easy, clean, and then getting intricate. So I have my preheated cast iron. I'm going to pick up my scored loaf and gently lower it into the cast iron. Carefully, of course. And then I'm immediately going to put the lid on and return it to the oven. And then lower the oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to bake it covered for 30 minutes. And then after 30 minutes, we're going to take the cover off and continue baking it to get some of that good golden brown color. Basically, what we've done is kind of created a steam oven inside this Dutch oven. So the moisture from the loaf actually helps prevent the crust formation. So it allows for a better rise and a more open crumb structure. So after that additional 15 to 20 minutes uncovered, we're going to go ahead and temp our bread. If you keep it in there for the full, 40 to 50 minutes, I'm sure it's going to be done. But for good measure, we want to make sure it's over, 200, 210 degrees. We're going to take it out of the cast iron and put it on a cooling rack, remove the parchment, and this is the best time you should listen to the crackle of the dough. Here's an aerial shot of our dough, and you can see the 4 slashes we made, really opened up really nicely, and you can still see the indents from the banneton. Beautiful golden brown. It smells delicious. It feels great. Time to dig in once it cools. You got to let this cool, okay? So we let our bread cool to 70 degrees, or basically until you can't feel any warmth out of it, and then cut it in half. And we want to go ahead and evaluate what we see. In my opinion, this loaf is probably about an 8.5 out of 10. I would be looking for, more variable air cells. I might consider doing another fold. I might even consider letting it sit out at room temp a little bit longer when I take it out of the fridge, so it's really room temperature when it gets baked. Um, but in general, bread is about controlling the elements and reading the dough. There are two things going on: there's fermentation and gluten development, and you should experiment. My advice is to change one thing each time and see how that affects the final product. Have fun, practice, and the Baker New Bedford can't wait to be back in business. Stay safe, stay home, bake bread. Thanks, guys.